Welcome to Riverdale, a town that appears quiet and peaceful on the surface. But beneath that calm exterior lies a web of corruption, buried secrets, and a fight for justice that will shake the community to its core. When Police Chief Jacob Parker uncovers a disturbing pattern of misconduct within his own department, it sends shockwaves through the town, pitting him against the very officers he's sworn to lead. As Jacob battles to expose the truth, his family becomes a target, and Riverdale itself begins to unravel. Will justice prevail, or will those in power succeed in silencing him? Stick around to find out. And before we dive into this gripping story, don't forget to hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear what you think about the fight for justice and the choices Jacob faces. Let's get started, ***. The sun hung low in the late afternoon sky as Emily Parker turned onto the familiar streets of Riverdale. Her 11-year-old daughter, Chloe, sat in the back seat, her legs swinging beneath her as she chattered excitedly about her day at school. It was a peaceful scene, one that, for Emily, felt like the culmination of years of hard work and sacrifice. She and her husband, Jacob Parker, had built a good life here. Jacob was the police chief, respected by his peers and well-liked in the community. Emily had a fulfilling career as an elementary school teacher, and Chloe was thriving in school. "Mom, guess what?" Chloe's voice bubbled from the back seat, pulling Emily out of her thoughts. "What is it, sweetie?" Emily asked, glancing at her daughter through the rearview mirror. Chloe's face was lit up with excitement, her brown eyes sparkling with pride. "Miss, Harrison said my drawing was the best in class today." Chloe's cheeks flushed as she beamed with pride. "She even put it up on the board for everyone to see." Emily smiled, warmth filling her chest. "That's wonderful, Chloe. I've always known you were an artist. Your dad is going to be so proud when he hears about it." Chloe nodded eagerly. "Do you think Dad will put it on the fridge?" "Of course he will," Emily said with a laugh. "You know how much he loves your drawings." For a few moments, everything felt right with the world. Emily drove the familiar route home, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of Chloe's voice making the world outside seem peaceful and unchanging. Riverdale was the kind of town where neighbors still waved at each other, where children played in the streets without fear, and where Emily felt a sense of safety she hadn't known growing up in a larger, less personal city. She slowed as they approached a stop sign, her mind drifting to what she would make for dinner. Maybe she could surprise Jacob with his favorite, lasagna. They hadn't had a proper family meal in a few days, due to Jacob's late hours at the station. Tonight could be different. A quiet evening just for the three of them. But as Emily turned the corner, her heart jolted at the sudden flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror. The unmistakable sound of a police siren broke the peaceful silence, sending a wave of unease through her. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Chloe asked, her voice small and unsure. Emily's pulse quickened. She had never been in trouble with the law before, never even gotten a speeding ticket. "No, honey, I'm sure it's just a mistake." She pulled over to the side of the road, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Her heart raced, and she took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. This had to be routine, nothing more than a misunderstanding. The officer would check her license, maybe remind her to watch her speed, and then she and Chloe would be on their way. The police car parked behind them, and Emily watched in the mirror as the officer stepped out. He was tall, with a muscular build and a stern expression that seemed cold, almost menacing. His sunglasses reflected the bright sunlight, obscuring his eyes as he approached their car. Emily rolled down her window, her hands shaking slightly. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. "License and registration," the officer barked, ignoring her greeting entirely. His tone was clipped, the kind of voice used to immediate obedience. Emily fumbled with her purse, her fingers clumsy as she searched for her wallet. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You were going 5 miles over the speed limit," he said, his eyes narrowing as if daring her to protest. "That's the problem." "I'm sorry, I didn't realize—" Emily started, but the officer cut her off before she could finish. "Save it," he said, leaning closer to the window, his voice dripping with disdain. You people always have an excuse, don't you? Emily's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a slap in the face, sharp and cutting. She forced herself to meet the officer's gaze, her mind racing. Was this really happening? Her skin prickled with anxiety, but she tried to keep her composure. Chloe was watching. She had to stay calm for her daughter's sake. I don't understand. Emily began again, but the officer interrupted, his tone growing harsher. What's there to understand? He said, his lips curling into a sneer. People like you think the rules don't apply. Well, guess what? They do. You might be used to getting away with things, but not here. Chloe, who had been quiet in the back seat, shifted nervously. Her small voice broke the tension in the car. Mom, is everything okay? That innocent question seemed to enrage the officer even more. He straightened up, glancing briefly at Chloe before turning his attention back to Emily. You teaching your kid that the rules don't matter too, huh? Emily's chest tightened, fear and anger swirling inside her. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet this officer was treating her like a criminal. But what could she say? What could she do? The officer lingered for a moment longer, his cold stare making her feel smaller and more powerless than she ever had. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and marched back to his patrol car. Emily sat frozen, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Chloe was silent in the back seat, her wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Mom, Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Why was he so mean? Emily blinked, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. She had no answer for her daughter. All she could do was offer a shaky smile and whisper, I don't know, baby. I don't know. The drive home felt longer than usual. The silence between Emily and Chloe was heavy, broken only by the occasional sound of the turn signal or the hum of the car's engine. The earlier excitement of Chloe's school day had been drained away, replaced by a quiet tension that hung over them like a dark cloud. As they pulled into the driveway of their cozy suburban home, Emily parked the car and sat there for a moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel. Her mind was racing, replaying the encounter with the officer over and over again. She felt violated, humiliated, and most of all, powerless. She had always believed that being respectful and following the rules would protect her from situations like this. But today, that belief had been shattered. Chloe unbuckled her seatbelt and looked at her mother, her expression full of questions she didn't know how to ask. Emily forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil she felt inside. Come on, sweetie, she said softly. Let's go inside. Chloe hesitated for a moment before climbing out of the car. They walked to the front door in silence, and as soon as they stepped inside, Emily felt the familiar warmth of their home wrap around her. But the comfort she usually found here was absent. The walls that had always felt like a safe haven now seemed stifling, closing in on her as the weight of the day pressed down. Mom? Chloe asked quietly as she sat at the kitchen table. Was that man mad at us? Did we do something wrong? Emily's heart broke at the question. She knelt beside her daughter, brushing a hand through her soft brown hair. No, baby. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, people say things that aren't fair, and it's not your fault. Then why did he talk to you like that? Emily struggled to find the right words. How could she explain something so complex and painful to her daughter? How could she make sense of something that deep down didn't make sense at all? I don't know, Emily said softly, her voice cracking with emotion. But I promise you, we're okay. We're safe now. Chloe nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. She didn't understand, and Emily wasn't sure if she ever would. How could she explain that some people judged others based on things they couldn't control? How could she explain that, even when you followed the rules, you could still be treated unfairly? Emily stood up, her hands trembling as she began preparing dinner. She tried to focus on the simple tasks, chopping vegetables, boiling water, but her mind kept drifting back to the officer's harsh words. You people always have an excuse. People like you. What did he mean by that? She knew, of course. The implication was clear, but acknowledging it felt like opening a door she had kept closed for a long time. She had worked hard her entire life to avoid situations like this, to avoid the kind of scrutiny and judgment that came from people who saw her as different. She had played by the rules, built a life she was proud of, and surrounded herself with people who respected her. But today, all of that had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. The officer's words had reduced her to something small, something less than. And the worst part was that Chloe had seen it. Her daughter had witnessed her mother being disrespected and humiliated, and there was nothing Emily could do to erase that memory. As she stirred the sauce on the stove, Emily glanced at the clock. Jacob would be home soon. The thought of telling him what had happened filled her with dread. She knew he would be furious, not just because of the way she had been treated, but because of what it would mean for him as the police chief. How could he navigate this? How could he be both the husband who defended his wife and the police chief who was responsible for the actions of his officers? The sound of the front door opening pulled Emily out of her thoughts. She turned to see Jacob walking into the kitchen, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey, love," he said, his voice warm but tired. He set his bag down and walked over to her, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. "How was your day?" Emily swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the spoon she was holding. This was the moment she had been dreading, and yet she knew she couldn't keep it from him any longer. "Jacob," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "we need to talk." Jacob's smile faded as he looked at her more closely, his eyes narrowing with concern. "What's wrong?" Emily set the spoon down and turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. I was pulled over by one of your officers today, Daniel Hayes. He said some things." Jacob's expression darkened, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Things? What do you mean? What did he say?" Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "He made some comments about me, about people like me. He didn't pull me over because I was speeding. He pulled me over because of how I look." Jacob's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. "He said that? He actually said that?" Emily nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know what to do, Jacob." Chloe was in the car. She heard everything. Jacob turned away, pacing the kitchen as he tried to process what he had just heard. One of his own officers, someone he trusted, had disrespected his wife in front of their daughter. His mind raced, filled with anger and disbelief. "I'll deal with it," Jacob said, his voice low and tense. "Hayes can't get away with this." Emily reached out, grabbing his arm before he could storm out of the room. "Jacob, wait. Please think about this. I don't want you to make things worse." Jacob stopped, his hand resting on the doorknob. He took a deep breath, his shoulders tense. "How am I supposed to think about this, Emily? One of my men disrespected you, my wife. I can't just sit here and do nothing." "I know," Emily said, her voice trembling. "But this isn't just about us. You have to be careful. If this gets out, it could destroy your career. The whole town could turn against you." Jacob turned back to her, his face softening as he looked into her eyes. He walked over to her, gently cupping her face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I won't let this go, but I'll be careful. I promise." Emily nodded, though the fear in her heart remained. She knew this was only the beginning. What had started as a routine traffic stop was about to spiral into something much bigger, something that could change their lives forever. The following morning, Jacob Parker sat at his desk in the Riverdale Police Department, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. But Jacob's thoughts were clouded with the weight of what he was about to do. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he prepared to pull up Officer Daniel Hayes' personnel file. Jacob had always trusted his officers, at least most of them. Riverdale was a small town, and the department felt like an extended family. Sure, there were disagreements and personality clashes, but overall, the officers were good people who wanted to protect their community. Or so Jacob had thought. The events of the previous day had changed everything. As police chief, it was his responsibility to investigate misconduct. But when the accusation came from his own wife, his heart ached just thinking about how broken Emily had looked. There was a personal weight to the decision. He knew that if he found something, it wouldn't just be another internal matter. It would shake the very foundations of the department and his role within it. Jacob hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen. He knew that opening this file could lead to consequences that extended far beyond Officer Hayes. If Hayes had a history of misconduct, then how had it been ignored or overlooked for so long? Who else was responsible for allowing it to continue? His gut twisted with the realization that uncovering the truth might mean exposing more than just one bad officer. But he had no choice. He had to know. Taking a deep breath, Jacob began typing. Hayes's personnel file opened, and Jacob immediately began scrolling through the records. At first, everything appeared normal. Routine assignments, positive performance reviews. But then, tucked between standard commendations, Jacob found what he was looking for. Complaints. 5 complaints, to be exact. Jacob clicked on the first one, his heart sinking as the details filled the screen. A young black man had filed a complaint against Hayes for racial profiling and harassment during a traffic stop. The report had been marked unsubstantiated and quietly closed. Jacob's fingers tightened on the mouse as he opened the next file. It was another complaint, this time from a Latina woman, who claimed that Hayes had treated her disrespectfully during a routine stop, making comments that were disturbingly similar to the ones Emily had described. Again, the complaint had been dismissed with no action taken. He read through each complaint, his anger and frustration building with every word. There were patterns here, undeniable ones. Each case involved a minority citizen, and in every instance the complaint had been buried, either marked as lacking evidence or resolved with no disciplinary action. Jacob closed the files, leaning back in his chair, his mind racing. How had this happened under his watch? As police chief, he was supposed to uphold justice, but it was clear that the system had failed. His system had failed. A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. Rachel Davis, his second in command, stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Jacob, you okay?" He hadn't told her about the previous day's events yet, but he knew he couldn't keep this a secret from her. Rachel had always been loyal, and she was one of the few people in the department Jacob truly trusted. If anyone would understand, it was her. "Come in," Jacob said, motioning for her to sit. As she took a seat across from him, Jacob closed Hayes's file and folded his hands on the desk. "Rachel, something happened yesterday." He hesitated, then added, "Emily was pulled over by Hayes. He made some comments, racial comments." Rachel's brow furrowed. "Comments? What kind of comments?" Jacob sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He stopped her for speeding, but it wasn't about the speed. He talked down to her, insulted her, insinuated things. Chloe was in the car. She heard everything. Rachel's eyes widened in shock. "Hayes said those things in front of Chloe. That's unacceptable," Jacob finished, his voice hardening. "But it's more than that. I've been looking through his file. He's got a history, Rachel. Multiple complaints, all involving minority citizens, all swept under the rug." Rachel sat back, her expression turning grim. "How did this happen? Why didn't we catch it sooner?" Jacob shook his head, frustration gnawing at him. "I don't know, but I'm going to find out. This can't go on." Rachel studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'm with you, Jacob, but you know this won't be easy. Once you start pulling at these threads, you might not like what you find. The department's got a lot of history. Some of it we haven't always questioned." "I don't care," Jacob said, his resolve hardening. "We've ignored this for too long. It's time to fix it." Rachel nodded, her expression serious. "Then let's get to work." Later that night, Emily sat in the living room, absently flipping through a magazine as Chloe worked on her homework at the kitchen table. The house was unusually quiet, save for the soft sound of Chloe's pencil scratching against the paper. But the stillness did nothing to ease the tension in Emily's chest. Since her encounter with Officer Hayes, Emily had felt like she was walking around with a weight on her shoulders. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear his words echoing in her head. "You people always have an excuse. People like you." She had thought she was stronger than this, that after all the progress she and Jacob had made in their lives, she wouldn't be affected by something so hateful. But the truth was, it had cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She glanced at Chloe, who was hunched over her math worksheet, her brow furrowed in concentration. Emily hadn't told her much about what had happened after they got home that day. Chloe had asked questions, of course. Questions that Emily wasn't sure how to answer. But she had done her best to reassure her daughter that everything would be okay. Still, Emily could see the change in Chloe. Normally, Chloe was full of energy and chatter. But ever since the traffic stop, she had been quieter, more withdrawn. It broke Emily's heart to think that her daughter's view of the world had been shaken in such a cruel way. The sound of the front door opening startled Emily, and she turned to see Jacob stepping inside, his expression tired but determined. He set his bag down and walked over to Emily, giving her a quick kiss on the forehead. "Hey," Jacob said softly, sitting down beside her on the couch. "How was your day?" Emily shrugged, setting the magazine aside. "The same as usual. Chloe's been working hard on her homework." She glanced over at their daughter, who was still engrossed in her math problems. "How about you?" Jacob hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. "I've been looking into Hayes's file. It's worse than I thought." Emily's heart sank. "What do you mean?" "There are more complaints," Jacob said, his voice low so Chloe wouldn't overhear. "Racial profiling, harassment, similar to what you experienced. And they've all been buried. No disciplinary action, no follow-up." Emily's stomach churned. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was like a punch to the gut. How could this have happened, Jacob? How could this go on for so long without anyone doing anything? Jacob shook his head, frustration clear in his eyes. "I don't know, but I'm not letting it go. I'm going to keep digging until I figure out who's responsible for covering this up." Emily bit her lip, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to tell Jacob to stop, to just let it go and protect himself from the fallout. But another part of her knew that this was bigger than them. If Hayes had been allowed to get away with this for so long, how many other people had suffered in silence? "What are you going to do?" Emily asked quietly. Jacob looked at her, his expression resolute. "I'm going to hold him accountable, and I'm going to make sure the department is cleaned up, no matter what it takes." Emily nodded, though the fear in her heart remained. She knew that Jacob was doing the right thing, but she also knew that the road ahead was going to be difficult. Perhaps more difficult than either of them could imagine. As the days passed, word of Emily's encounter with Officer Hayes began to spread throughout Riverdale. What had initially been a private family matter quickly became a public controversy, and soon, people across town were talking about what had happened. Some residents were outraged, calling for accountability and demanding that Hayes be fired. Others, however, defended the police department, insisting that Emily must have done something to provoke the officer's behavior. It wasn't long before protests erupted outside the police station, with people holding signs that read, "End racial profiling" and "Justice for Emily." The peaceful town of Riverdale, which had always prided itself on its sense of community, was now divided in a way that no one had seen before. From the window of their house, Emily could see the news coverage on TV, showing images of people gathered outside the station, chanting for change. The sight of it made her stomach churn. She had never wanted to be at the center of something like this, never wanted to be the face of a movement. All she had wanted was to be treated with respect, to be seen as a person, not a stereotype. Chloe, who had been sitting quietly on the couch, looked up at her mother. "Mom, why are all those people outside Dad's work?" Emily sighed, sitting down beside her daughter. "They're protesting, sweetie. They want to make sure that people like Officer Hayes can't hurt others." "But are they mad at Dad?" Chloe asked, her voice small and unsure. "No, they're not mad at Dad," Emily said, her heart aching at the worry in Chloe's eyes. "They're mad at the people who did something wrong. Your dad is trying to help make things right." Chloe nodded, though the confusion in her eyes remained. "But why did it happen, Mom? Why did that man say those things to us?" Emily blinked back tears, pulling Chloe into a tight hug. "I don't know, baby. I don't know. But what I do know is that your dad and I are going to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again." Inside the Riverdale Police Department, tensions were rising. The protests outside the station had grown larger, and the pressure on Jacob to act against Officer Hayes was mounting. But it wasn't just the public demanding answers. His own officers were divided on how to handle the situation. Some supported Jacob, agreeing that Hayes needed to be held accountable for his actions. Others, however, were more loyal to Hayes and the unwritten code of silence that had protected officers for years. They saw Jacob's investigation as a betrayal, a sign that their chief wasn't willing to defend his own men. Deputy Chief Megan Ford, a longtime colleague of Jacob's, was particularly vocal in her opposition. One afternoon, she barged into Jacob's office, her face set in a hard, determined expression. "Jacob, we need to talk," Megan said, closing the door behind her. "I've been hearing things. You're digging into Hayes's file, questioning his conduct. Is that true?" Jacob leaned back in his chair, meeting her gaze. "It's true. There are multiple complaints against Hayes, and they've all been dismissed without investigation. I'm looking into it." Megan folded her arms across her chest, her eyes narrowing. "I understand you're upset about what happened with Emily, but you need to be careful. This department has a reputation to uphold. If you start airing dirty laundry in public, it's going to make us all look bad." "I'm not worried about appearances, Megan," Jacob said, his voice firm. "I'm worried about doing what's right," Megan scoffed, shaking her head. "You think this is going to fix anything? You think exposing Hayes is going to make the protests go away? It's only going to make things worse. The public already sees us as the enemy. If you turn on your own officers, they'll lose what little trust they have left in us." Jacob clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling inside him. "I'm not turning on my officers. I'm holding one officer accountable for misconduct. There's a difference." Megan took a step closer, her voice lowering. "Think about what you're doing, Jacob. You're the police chief. If you throw Hayes under the bus, the rest of the department is going to see you as a traitor. Is that what you want?" Jacob stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Megan was right about one thing. This investigation would have serious consequences for his relationship with the rest of the department. But he also knew that if he didn't act, he would be complicit in the corruption he had sworn to fight against. "I don't care what the rest of the department thinks of me," Jacob said, his voice steady. "I care about justice, and I'm not going to let one bad officer ruin the trust we've worked so hard to build in this community." Megan's eyes narrowed, her posture tense. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you. Once you start down this path, there's no going back." Jacob watched as she turned and stormed out of his office, slamming the door behind her. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. There was no turning back now. Jacob sat at his desk, the fluorescent lights overhead casting a sterile glow over the room. Files were strewn across the surface, each one representing a complaint that had been ignored, dismissed, or quietly closed. His stomach churned with a mix of anger and disbelief as he scanned each document. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that Officer Hayes wasn't the only problem. There was something far more sinister at work. The complaints against Hayes had followed a disturbing pattern. Racially charged language, abuse of power during routine stops, and targeting of minority citizens. But as Jacob expanded his investigation, he found complaints against other officers in the department as well. Officer Brian Davis had a string of similar complaints, as did Officer Stephen King. Each one had been marked unsubstantiated and pushed aside. Jacob clicked through the department's internal database, searching for any patterns. There was something about the way these complaints had been handled, how they had been neatly tucked away, hidden from view. The more he looked, the more it seemed like someone had deliberately buried the reports to protect the officers involved. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. This wasn't just about Hayes. This was systemic. And if he was right, the cover-up extended to people in positions of power. People who had spent years ensuring that officers like Hayes were shielded from accountability. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Rachel Davis stood in the doorway, a stack of papers in her hands. Her expression was serious, her usual easygoing demeanor replaced with a tension that mirrored Jacob's own. "I've been going through the files you asked for," Rachel said, stepping inside. She set the papers down on the desk, her brow furrowed. "It's worse than we thought." Jacob's heart sank. How bad is it? Rachel glanced down at the papers, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the reports. There's a pattern. Hayes isn't the only one who's been involved in misconduct. Other officers, Davis, King, even a few higher-ups, have similar complaints against them. And every one of those complaints was handled by the same person. Jacob's eyes narrowed. Who? Rachel hesitated before meeting his gaze. Megan Ford. The name sent a chill down Jacob's spine. Megan Ford, his deputy chief, had been one of the department's most trusted leaders for years. She was known for her sharp mind and her no-nonsense approach to policing. But now, it seemed like she had been using her position to protect corrupt officers and bury complaints that should have led to disciplinary action. Jacob sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had always trusted Megan, had relied on her to help run the department. But now, the evidence was clear. Megan had been covering up misconduct, allowing officers like Hayes to continue abusing their power without consequence. Do we have proof? Jacob asked, his voice tight. Rachel nodded, flipping through the stack of papers until she found what she was looking for. She handed Jacob a series of emails, each one addressed to Megan from various officers, including Hayes. In the emails, the officers requested Megan's help in handling complaints that had been filed against them. Megan's responses were brief but damning. Taken care of. No further action needed. Jacob's stomach twisted. She's been covering for them. Rachel nodded grimly. For years. Jacob stared at the emails, his mind struggling to process the full extent of the betrayal. Megan Ford, the woman he had trusted with the department, had been protecting corrupt officers. Officers who had hurt people like Emily. People who had trusted the police to keep them safe. I can't believe this, Jacob muttered, shaking his head. How could she do this? Rachel's expression softened. I don't know. But now that we know, we have to do something. This can't stay buried. Jacob nodded, his resolve hardening. We're not going to let it. Megan's going to answer for this, and so are the officers she's been protecting. The following morning, Jacob requested a private meeting with Megan Ford in his office. He had spent the night poring over the evidence, preparing himself for the confrontation he knew was coming. As the door to his office creaked open, Megan stepped inside, her face calm and composed, as if she had no idea what was about to happen. You wanted to see me? Megan asked, closing the door behind her. Jacob motioned for her to sit. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared down at her. I've been doing some digging, Megan. There are things I've found that I need you to explain. Megan raised an eyebrow, her posture relaxed. Is that so? What kind of things? Jacob felt the heat rising in his chest as he pulled out the emails Rachel had uncovered. He dropped them onto the desk in front of Megan, his jaw tight. I found evidence that you've been covering for officers like Hayes, burying complaints, protecting them from disciplinary action. Megan glanced down at the emails, her face unreadable. After a moment, she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. And what exactly are you accusing me of, Jacob? I'm accusing you of corruption, Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with anger. I'm accusing you of enabling misconduct, of allowing officers like Hayes to hurt people and get away with it. Megan's expression didn't falter. Instead, she let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. Jacob, you've always been too idealistic, too naive. You think you can run this department by following every rule, by playing everything by the book. But the real world doesn't work like that. Jacob felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. What are you talking about? Megan sighed, as if she were explaining something simple to a child. This town, this department, it's not as perfect as you want it to be. There are people out there who don't respect the law, who see the police as the enemy. If we don't protect our own, if we don't shield officers from the kind of scrutiny that would tear this department apart, then we'll lose everything. Jacob stared at her, his mind reeling. So, you're saying it's okay to cover up misconduct? To protect bad cops just because they wear the same uniform as us? Megan's gaze hardened. I'm saying it's necessary. We can't afford to have the public turn against us. If you expose this, if you bring down officers like Hayes, then the entire department will be under attack. And once that happens, you'll lose control of this town." Jacob's chest tightened with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You've let this go on for too long, Megan. You've allowed people like Hayes to abuse their power and get away with it, and now you're trying to justify it." "I'm protecting this department," Megan snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "I'm protecting us from being torn apart by people who don't understand what it takes to keep a community safe. You think you're doing the right thing by digging into this, but you're playing with fire. If you go public with this, you'll destroy everything we've built." Jacob felt his heart pounding in his chest, but he didn't waver. "What we've built is rotten, Megan. And if we don't fix it, we're no better than the people we're supposed to be protecting this town from." Megan's eyes narrowed, her posture stiffening. "You're making a mistake, Jacob. If you go through with this, it'll be your career on the line, not mine. You'll be seen as the chief who turned against his own officers. Is that really what you want?" Jacob stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But in the end, he knew there was no choice. He couldn't stay silent. Not after everything he had seen, after everything Emily had been through. "I don't care about my career," Jacob said, his voice firm. "I care about doing what's right." Megan's expression turned cold. "Then I guess you've made your choice." Without another word, Megan stood and walked out of the office, leaving Jacob standing alone in the silence. The fallout from Jacob's confrontation with Megan Ford was immediate. Whispers spread throughout the department, and soon everyone knew that the chief was investigating misconduct within their ranks. The tension in the air was thick, and Jacob could feel the hostility from some of his officers as he walked down the halls. The department, which had once felt like a close-knit team, was now divided. Some officers supported Jacob's investigation, agreeing that Hayes and others like him needed to be held accountable. But others, those loyal to Megan Ford, saw Jacob as a traitor, someone who had turned on his own in a time of crisis. As Jacob sat in his office reviewing more files, Rachel stepped in, her expression grim. "It's getting worse out there, Jacob. The department's splitting in two. Some of the officers are refusing to work with those who support you. They're saying you're turning your back on the department." Jacob sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I expected this, but we can't back down now, Rachel. We have to see this through." Rachel nodded, though the worry in her eyes remained. "I know, but you need to be careful. Ford still has a lot of people on her side, and they're not going to let this go without a fight." Jacob met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "Let them fight. We're doing the right thing, and that's all that matters." As Rachel left the office, Jacob turned back to his files, his mind focused on the task at hand. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and danger, but he also knew that they were on the right side of history. He wouldn't stop until the truth was brought to light. The decision had been made. Jacob knew that the time for internal discussions and quiet investigations was over. Megan Ford's corruption and the department-wide cover-ups could no longer stay hidden behind the closed doors of the Riverdale Police Department. It was time for the truth to come out, time to bring the story to the public. Jacob stood in his kitchen early one morning, staring at his cup of coffee as the sun began to rise. Emily walked in, her hair still tousled from sleep. She paused when she saw the look on his face. "You're going to do it today, aren't you?" Emily asked softly, sitting down across from him. Jacob nodded, his eyes heavy with the weight of the decision. "Yeah, I have to. It's the only way to expose everything." Emily reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "You're doing the right thing, Jacob. I know it's hard, but people need to know what's happening. They need to understand the truth." Jacob squeezed her hand, grateful for her support. He'd known from the beginning that this moment would come, that at some point, the investigation would leave the confines of the department and become a public battle. But now that it was here, the fear of what was to come loomed large. He wasn't just risking his career. He was risking his reputation, his standing in the community, and the stability of their family. "Do you think we're ready for what's coming?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily smiled gently. "We've been through worse, Jacob, and we'll get through this too, as long as we stick together." Jacob nodded, taking a deep breath. "Then let's get ready." A crowd had gathered outside the Riverdale Police Department that afternoon. Reporters, protesters, and local residents were all there, waiting for Jacob to step up to the podium. The sun beat down on the crowd, the heat only adding to the simmering tension that had taken hold of the town. Jacob stood behind the glass doors of the station, peering out at the sea of people. He could see Rachel standing nearby, her arms crossed as she watched the scene unfold. Emily and Chloe were there too, standing at the edge of the crowd, their presence a source of strength for Jacob. "Are you ready for this?" Rachel asked, stepping up beside him. Jacob nodded, though his heart pounded in his chest. "As ready as I'll ever be. Just remember why you're doing this," Rachel said, her voice steady. "For Emily? For Chloe? For everyone who's been affected by the corruption in this department." Jacob took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I won't forget." He stepped outside, the doors closing behind him with a soft thud. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder as he approached the podium. Microphones from various news outlets pointed directly at him. He could feel the weight of their gazes, the anticipation hanging in the air. Jacob cleared his throat, gripping the edges of the podium as he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," Jacob started, his voice clear but tense. "I stand before you not just as the police chief of Riverdale, but as a member of this community, a community that has been deeply hurt by the actions of some of the officers in our department." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Over the past few months, I have been investigating complaints against certain officers in the Riverdale Police Department. Complaints that were ignored, dismissed, or covered up. What I have found is disturbing. Officers like Daniel Hayes have engaged in racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power. And these actions were protected by leadership within the department, including Deputy Chief Megan Ford." The crowd erupted in murmurs, the air thick with shock and disbelief. Jacob could feel the weight of their reactions, but he pressed on. "I have evidence, emails, internal documents, and testimonies that show how these complaints were buried, how officers were shielded from accountability, and how the department has failed the very people it is sworn to protect. I can no longer stay silent about this. The people of Riverdale deserve better." Jacob's voice grew stronger as he continued. "I am calling for a full investigation into the Riverdale Police Department, including my own leadership. We need to root out this corruption, hold those responsible accountable, and rebuild the trust that has been broken." As he stepped back from the podium, the reporters bombarded him with questions, their voices overlapping in a chaotic flurry. But Jacob didn't flinch. He had said what needed to be said. The truth was out there now, and there was no turning back. The backlash came swiftly. Within hours of the press conference, Megan Ford and her allies launched a counterattack, determined to discredit Jacob and salvage their reputations. Megan appeared on local news channels, her calm demeanor masking the fury that simmered beneath the surface. "I'm shocked by Chief Parker's accusations," Megan said in an interview, her voice steady but sharp. "These claims are baseless and completely false. It's clear that Chief Parker has allowed his personal grievances to cloud his judgment. He's using his position to settle a score, and I'm confident that a thorough investigation will prove that these allegations are without merit." Jacob watched the interview from home, his jaw clenched as he listened to Megan's words. She was turning the narrative against him, painting him as the one in the wrong, an unstable chief who was lashing out to protect his wife. The smear campaign began to take hold, with social media buzzing with rumors and accusations. Some defended Jacob, praising him for his bravery in exposing the corruption. But others were quick to side with Megan, accusing Jacob of betraying his own department. "Don't let it get to you," Emily said softly, sitting beside him on the couch. "People are always going to talk, but the truth will come out." "I know," Jacob muttered, his voice tight. "I just hate that she's twisting this into something it's not." Emily placed a hand on his arm. "You've done everything you can to bring the truth to light. Now you just have to let the investigation run its course." But Jacob knew it wouldn't be that simple. Megan was a master at manipulation, and she still had powerful allies within the department. If she succeeded in turning the public against him, the investigation could fall apart before it even started. As the days passed, the tension in Riverdale only grew. The town, once known for its sense of unity, was now deeply divided. Protests erupted outside the police station, with residents demanding justice and accountability. Signs reading "Support Chief Parker" and "End Corruption" stood alongside those declaring "Back the Blue" and "Parker is a traitor." Social media became a battleground, with residents and outsiders alike taking sides. Some praised Jacob for his courage in exposing the corruption within the department, while others accused him of turning his back on the police force. The heated debates spilled into the streets, with neighbors who had once been friendly now finding themselves on opposite sides of the issue. One afternoon, as Jacob was walking through the town, a group of protesters approached him. A middle-aged man, his face red with anger, stepped forward, his voice filled with venom. "You think you're some kind of hero, Parker?" the man spat. "All you've done is drag this town through the mud. You're supposed to protect your officers, not throw them under the bus." Jacob stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'm protecting the people of this town. I'm doing what's right." The man sneered, his hands clenched into fists. "What's right? You've turned this whole town against each other. We used to trust our police, and now look what you've done." Before the situation could escalate, a woman stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "He's doing the right thing. You should be ashamed of yourself for defending people like Hayes." The two sides squared off, and for a moment it seemed like things might turn violent. But Jacob raised his hand, his voice steady. "Please, everyone, calm down. This isn't about dividing the town. It's about finding the truth and holding people accountable. That's all I want." The crowd murmured, the tension still thick in the air. But after a few moments, the protesters began to disperse, though the anger and division remained. It wasn't long before the town's division was mirrored in the courtroom. A formal investigation into the corruption within the Riverdale Police Department was launched, and both Jacob and Megan Ford were called to testify. The media descended on the courthouse, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions as the trial began. Jacob sat beside his attorney, Monica Green, a sharp and determined civil rights lawyer who had agreed to represent him. She had built her reputation on cases of police misconduct, and she was ready to take on Megan and her defense team. Across the courtroom, Megan sat with her own lawyer, Gregory Mathis, a well-known defense attorney who specialized in protecting high-profile clients. His strategy was clear from the start: discredit Jacob and cast doubt on the legitimacy of the investigation. The trial began with opening statements, both sides laying out their cases. Monica wasted no time in presenting the evidence: emails, internal memos, and testimonies from former officers, showing how Megan had buried complaints and protected officers like Hayes. She painted a picture of a department that had allowed corruption to thrive, all while betraying the trust of the community it was supposed to protect. Megan's defense, however, was just as fierce. Gregory argued that Jacob's actions were motivated by personal grievances and that the evidence had been misinterpreted or exaggerated. He claimed that Megan had acted within the bounds of her authority, and that any mistakes made were unintentional. As the trial wore on, the tension in the courtroom grew thicker. Witnesses were called, including Rachel Davis, who testified about her own investigation into the department's misconduct. Her testimony was powerful, but Megan's defense team fought back hard, trying to poke holes in her credibility. Jacob knew that the trial was far from over, and that the outcome would determine not only his future, but the future of the entire department. The courthouse felt suffocating, the air thick with anticipation. Every day, more people showed up, packing the seats and lining the walls. Reporters hovered around the entrance, eagerly waiting for the next piece of information to spill from the trial. The stakes had never been higher. Jacob sat at the defense table, his heart pounding as Monica Green delivered the opening argument for a critical day of testimony. Today, the prosecution planned to present a key witness, someone who could potentially break open the case against Megan Ford and her allies in the police department. The judge's gavel brought the courtroom to order, and all eyes turned to the doors at the back of the room as Detective Sarah Mitchell entered the room. Sarah had once worked alongside Megan, but she had come forward with new evidence that could tip the scales. As Sarah took the stand, the tension in the room was palpable. Monica approached her with careful precision. "Detective Mitchell, can you explain to the court your role in the Riverdale Police Department during the time in question?" Monica asked. Her voice calm and clear. Sarah nodded. "I was part of an internal task force assigned to review complaints against officers. My role was to investigate claims of misconduct and ensure that proper procedures were followed." Monica glanced at the jury before turning her attention back to Sarah. "And during your time on this task force, did you encounter any irregularities in how complaints were handled?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Megan, who sat stone-faced at the defense table. "Yes," she said finally. "There were numerous complaints, particularly against officers like Daniel Hayes and Brian Davis, that were consistently dismissed without a thorough investigation." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, but the judge quickly called for silence. Monica pressed forward. "Can you explain how these complaints were dismissed? Who was responsible for ensuring they didn't go through proper channels?" Sarah took a deep breath. "It was Deputy Chief Ford. She had final oversight on all complaint reviews. She made sure that certain cases were marked as unsubstantiated and buried in the system." The impact of Sarah's words reverberated through the room. Jacob watched as Megan's lawyer, Gregory Mathis, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew that Sarah's testimony would be hard to discredit. She had been on the inside, privy to all the details Megan had tried to hide. Monica continued, building the case brick by brick. "Did Deputy Chief Ford ever explain why these complaints were dismissed?" Sarah nodded. "She said it was to protect the department's image. That if we let these complaints see the light of day, it would destroy public trust. She believed that maintaining the department's reputation was more important than holding individual officers accountable." Jacob's stomach churned as the full extent of the cover-up came into focus. He had known there was corruption, but hearing the details laid out in court made it all the more real. Megan Ford had put her career and the department's image above justice, and innocent people had paid the price. The defense team had no choice but to put Megan Ford on the stand. It was their last, desperate move to salvage the case. Megan had always been known for her ability to command a room, her sharp intellect, and her confident demeanor. But as she sat in the witness chair, even she couldn't completely hide the strain. Gregory Mathis stood beside her, his questions carefully crafted to paint her in the best possible light. "Deputy Chief Ford, can you explain to the court your reasoning for dismissing these complaints? What was your goal?" Megan took a deep breath, her voice measured. "My goal was to protect the department. Riverdale has always had a close-knit relationship with its police force, and I believed that allowing certain complaints to escalate would create unnecessary division in the community. My intent was never to shield bad officers. It was to preserve the public's trust in the department." Gregory nodded, as though Megan's explanation were perfectly reasonable. "And did you believe at the time that you were acting in the best interest of Riverdale and its citizens?" "Yes," Megan replied firmly. "I believed I was doing what was necessary to keep the peace and maintain order." Jacob felt a knot tighten in his chest as he listened. Megan was twisting the truth, justifying her actions as if they were noble sacrifices rather than deliberate attempts to cover up wrongdoing. But then came Monica's cross-examination, and Jacob knew things were about to get difficult for Megan. Monica approached the witness stand, her eyes sharp. "Deputy Chief Ford, you've stated that your goal was to protect the department's reputation. But don't you think the public has a right to know when their police officers are engaging in misconduct?" Megan's confidence faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Of course, the public has a right to transparency, but there are times when releasing certain information could cause more harm than good. I was trying to balance the needs of the community." Monica leaned forward, her voice soft but pointed. "So, you believe that hiding racial profiling, harassment, and abuse of power was in the best interest of the community?" The courtroom fell silent, all eyes on Megan as she struggled to find the right words. "I don't believe in shielding misconduct," she said finally, her voice tight. But these cases were more complicated than you're making them out to be. Monica didn't back down. The complaints weren't complicated, Deputy Chief Ford. They were clear, and they were consistent. Multiple citizens, particularly from minority communities, came forward with claims of mistreatment by the same officers. And instead of investigating those claims, you buried them. How is that protecting the community? Megan's jaw tightened. I made judgment calls based on the information I had. I didn't act with malicious intent. Perhaps not, Monica said, her voice rising. But your actions had consequences. People like Emily Parker were hurt by officers you protected. Does that not matter? Megan's composure cracked for the first time, her voice shaking as she answered. Of course it matters. But I had to make difficult decisions. I was trying to protect the department from falling apart. Monica let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. And in doing so, you allowed a culture of corruption to fester. You sacrificed justice for the sake of appearances. Is that what the people of Riverdale deserve? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Megan had no response. The trial had stretched on for weeks, but now the end was in sight. The courtroom was packed as the jury filed back in, their expressions solemn as they prepared to deliver their verdict. Jacob sat beside Monica, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily and Chloe sat behind him, their hands clasped together in quiet anticipation. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. In the case of the State of Riverdale versus Megan Ford, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit misconduct, and falsification of records. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of approval. Megan sat frozen at the defense table, her face pale as the reality of the verdict set in. She had lost. Jacob let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was over. Megan Ford had been convicted, and the truth had finally come to light. As the judge banged the gavel, signaling the end of the trial, Jacob turned to Emily, who smiled through tears of relief. Chloe, sitting beside her, leaned into her mother's embrace, her eyes wide as she absorbed the gravity of the moment. Monica patted Jacob on the back, her smile triumphant. "We did it," she said softly. "You did it." Jacob nodded, his heart full of gratitude. It had been a long, painful journey, but justice had prevailed. The corruption that had plagued the department had been exposed, and now the real work of healing could begin. In the weeks following the trial, Riverdale slowly began to rebuild itself. The town, once divided by the scandal, was now united in its desire for change. New leadership was brought into the police department, and many of the officers involved in the cover-up were removed from their positions. There was a renewed focus on transparency and community engagement, with town hall meetings and public forums becoming a regular part of the process. Jacob, having resigned as police chief shortly after the trial, found himself at the center of the town's efforts to reform the department. Though he was no longer in uniform, his voice carried weight, and he was determined to ensure that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Jacob and Emily sat on their porch, watching Chloe play in the yard. The tension that had once gripped them was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. "You did it," Emily said softly, resting her head on Jacob's shoulder. "You brought them down." Jacob smiled, though the journey still felt surreal. "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you." Emily kissed his cheek. "And now we can finally move on." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sky turned shades of pink and orange. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't worried about the future. They had fought for justice, and now they could focus on healing. Weeks later, the town gathered for a community event in the town square. It was a celebration of the changes that had come to Riverdale, a symbol of the town's resilience and determination to move forward. Jacob and Emily stood together, watching as the new police chief, Lisa Thornton, gave a speech about the importance of accountability and rebuilding trust with the community. As the crowd applauded, Jacob felt a deep sense of pride. Riverdale had come a long way, and though the scars of the past would always remain, the town was stronger for having faced the truth. After the speeches, Families gathered to enjoy the festivities. Food trucks, live music, and children's games. Chloe ran off to play with her friends, her laughter filling the air. Jacob and Emily wandered through the crowd, greeting neighbors and friends. Everywhere they went, people thanked Jacob for what he had done, for standing up when it had been difficult, and for helping the town find its way back. As the evening wore on, Jacob and Emily found a quiet spot to sit and watch the sun set. The weight of everything they had been through still lingered, but it was lighter now. They had come out on the other side, stronger than before. "What's next?" Emily asked, her voice soft. Jacob smiled, taking her hand. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll face it together." They sat there, watching as the last of the sunlight faded and the stars began to appear in the night sky. The fight for justice in Riverdale had been hard, but it had been worth it. And now, for the first time in months, they could look forward to the future with hope. Thanks for joining us on this journey through Riverdale's fight for justice. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on future stories just like this. Whether it's thrilling narratives or powerful messages, there's always something new coming your way. Your support helps us create more engaging content. So subscribe, like, and share with others who love great storytelling. See you in the next one.